A few weeks ago, the world was watching what looked like the beginning of a historic confrontation. The US had launched a major military campaign against Iran. The message from Washington was clear. Iran would be forced to surrender. Its nuclear program would be dismantled. Its missile capability would be destroyed. Its regional influence would be rolled back. The Iranian government, after decades of confrontation with the US, would finally be forced to accept American terms. But that is not what happened. Instead, the conflict ended with something far more complicated, a negotiated agreement, a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and a major question. Did America win the war, or did Iran simply survive long enough to change the outcome? Because the biggest lesson from this conflict may not be about Iran. It may be about the limits of American power in the 21st century. So let's start with the biggest gamble of the Trump presidency. Donald Trump has always governed through pressure. His strategy is based on one central idea. Apply overwhelming force, economic, military, or diplomatic, and opponents will eventually give in. We saw this approach with Venezuela, and we also saw this approach with China. Now, with China, the US imposed tariffs and restrictions expecting Beijing to accept American demands. The assumption was that China, facing economic pain, would eventually compromise. But China did something completely different. It absorbed the pressure, it retaliated, and it demonstrated that it was willing to tolerate more pain than what Trump expected. The result? Not a Chinese surrender. Instead, a new balance of power. The relationship changed. The US became more cautious. China became more confident. And that same dynamic appeared again with Iran. So the original Iran strategy was enormous in terms of the US campaign. Trump wanted more than simply stopping a military threat. He wanted complete strategic transformation. The objectives included ending Iran's nuclear enrichment, removing its enriched uranium stockpile, destroying its ballistic missile program, cutting support for regional allies and proxy groups, weakening the Iranian leadership, and fundamentally changing Tehran's behavior. This was not a limited military operation. This was an attempt to reshape the entire Middle East. But history shows something important. Military power can destroy assets. It can damage infrastructure. It can create pressure. But changing the political calculations of a country is much harder. The US did not learn from Iraq. It did not learn from Afghanistan. Now, the gap between promise and reality is more interesting. This is the biggest story of the conflict, of how the objectives gradually changed. At the beginning, the message was Iran must surrender, but over time the demands became narrower. On nuclear material, the goal moved from removing Iran's enriched uranium completely to destroying it, to relocating it, to discussing dilution and limitations. On missiles, early statements suggested Iran's capabilities had been eliminated. Later assessments became more limited. On regime change, the conversation shifted from replacing the government to working with more pragmatic elements within Iran. This is the reality of war. The battlefield changes expectations. So what was actually achieved? The final agreement achieved two major things. First, the fighting has definitely stopped between the US and Israel versus Iran. And that matters, because escalation is becoming increasingly dangerous. Further attacks risked retaliation against American forces, Gulf countries, and global energy infrastructure. Second, the Strait of Hormuz has reopened. This was one of the most important outcomes for global markets. Why? Because the strait is one of the most important energy choke points on Earth. A prolonged closure could have triggered a major oil and LNG shock. Energy prices could have surged, inflation could have returned, and the global economy could have faced another major disruption. So even though the agreement did not achieve the original war aims, it avoided a potentially much larger crisis. Now, there's the problem nobody solved, and that is the nuclear question. This is the hardest issue that still was going to remain unresolved. Iran wants sanctions relief. The US wants restrictions on enrichment. Neither side wants to give the other what they want first. This creates a classic negotiation problem. Who moves first? The US believes pressure creates leverage. Iran believes patience creates leverage, and Iran has options. It can negotiate with Gulf countries. It can engage with Europe. It can work with countries that prioritize stability over confrontation. The US may have military superiority, but Iran still has strategic options. Now, this is a new Iran. Let's try and examine what is the Middle East after Iran. Now, the consequences of this conflict may extend far beyond Iran. The first impact, there is the reassessment of American reliability. For decades, many countries viewed the United States as the ultimate security guarantor. But recent conflicts have raised the question, will Washington always be willing to use its power? That answer appears more complicated. America remains the strongest military power in the world today, but its willingness to fight long, expensive conflicts is changing. The second impact, the Gulf states are likely to pursue more independence. Countries like Saudi Arabia and others are increasingly focused on resilience. They want economic diversification. They want more diplomatic flexibility and fewer risks. And the third impact, energy transition could accelerate. Every major energy crisis creates the same lesson. Dependence on vulnerable supply chains creates strategic risks. That strengthens the arguments for renewables, electrification, and alternative energy systems. Now, the most important question, did Trump win or lose? So how should history judge him? The answer depends on what you measure. If the goal was avoiding a larger regional war and reopening the Strait of Hormuz, the outcome was significant. If the goal was forcing Iran to surrender and transform the country, that outcome is very different. The problem is not that the United States lacks power. The US remains enormously powerful, militarily and economically. The problem was that the power has limits. A country can destroy weapons. It can strike military targets. It can impose economic costs. But it cannot always force another nation to accept political defeat. Now, this is something the US should have learned from Vietnam, should have learned from Iraq, should have learned from Afghanistan, and it still doesn't learn. So, what is the lesson? The Iran conflict may become one of the most defining examples of modern geopolitics in the 21st century. Not because of the battles, not because of the weapons, but because it reveals something fundamental. The world has changed. While America is still the most powerful country on the earth, but power today is more complicated. Rivals are more resilient. Economic pressure is less decisive. Military superiority does not guarantee political outcomes, and countries like Iran, China, and others have learned how to survive pressure. The biggest lesson may be this. In the 21st century, winning a war is no longer just about defeating an enemy. It's about achieving the political outcome you wanted when the war started. And that is where the hardest battles are fought. If you found this analysis useful, subscribe for more deep dives into energy, geopolitics, and the forces reshaping our world. Thank you.